My name is Allison Sandmyer-Graves. I am the CEO of Canadian Women in Sport, which is the leading national organization focused on systems change for women in sport in Canada. And our goal is really to transform the sport system to be more equitable and inclusive of women and girls, so that they can be empowered within sport and through sport as participants and leaders. My own background in sport, I'm relatively new to it professionally, having been now with Canadian Women in Sport for almost 5 years. And before that, my work was in the broader social impact space, really working on international development and community development. But I did have an illustrious stint as a campus rec coordinator at the University of Alberta during my undergrad. And of course, sport has been a huge part of my life since childhood. And so I believe very much in the power of sport to advance social change, and in this case, specifically to advance equity for women in society. I think there's no denying that it's absolutely essential. What we're talking about is transformational change of our society, and if you focus it more on sport, of an entire sport system, which involves institutions and cultures and norms that are long embedded in a masculine and Caucasian tradition. And many would say a white supremacist tradition. And so do we need to teach kids how to be part of a system that looks completely different? How to create a system that's completely different? Absolutely. And a lot of that is rooted in values and worldviews, understanding how the world works and what inclusion looks like. So we definitely need to start young. And I think there's an enormous opportunity in that, in the sense that as young people come into participating in sport, but especially leading in sport, the more that they can come in with a different understanding of how sport should unfold, the more they can be vehicles or agents of change in that respect. How do we do it? That's a big question. I think there's many different avenues to that. One that comes to mind is to ensure that there are women and people of color and people of a variety of backgrounds, persons with disabilities, and so on, who represent the true fabric of Canada, have them at the decision-making table within sport, have them as invisible leadership roles within sport, so that children are growing up with these people as role models, understanding that they are authorities in sport, getting a very tangible example of what inclusion in sport looks like. And so that we're not just perpetuating the model that we have right now of leadership, which is frankly not inclusive. So one of many ways, but I think that one could be very impactful. Well, first of all, I think it's something that we should be shooting for. And so I think it starts with valuing it. The status quo is really comfortable for people. And the status quo, of course, has a lot of white men in those positions, making decisions from their worldview. And so but we're not going to see change on that unless there's an understanding and a value and appreciation for what women and people of color bring to those roles, how they enhance the performance of organizations, how they drive innovation forward, really impacting the bottom line, as well as, being consistent with things that we value as Canadians, which is inclusion. So how do you do that? It really requires us to become more aware of and to counteract the biases that are really baked into a lot of how things get done, whether they're officially representative policies or more so in just the way we do things around here, there is a lot of bias that presents barriers to diverse people gaining access to those roles. And then to thrive in those roles beyond that, because we know it's not solely about diversity, you know, having a range of people of different backgrounds and lived experiences. It has to be about them feeling like they can show up as their true, authentic selves and contribute in a way that is respected and valued. So that means looking at our policies. That means evaluating our practices or auditing our practices. It means looking at the best practice that's out there, because there's so much that's been written on this at this point. It really just needs to be put into action. And you know, there are some great role models for this out there. And I look to the chair of our board, Natalie Cook, who's the VP at TSN and RDS, first woman in that role. And it gives me confidence that we will see more of this going forward, but we have a long way to go. That is $1 million question. How do we get more girls participating and staying in sport? Our work at Canadian Women in Sport is very much focused on this. And for us, it's a big part of creating that broader shift within society. Again, because the more girls who are participating and staying in sport, the more they are set up for success as leaders in every walk of life. And the more we can change the norms associated with being a girl or woman in our society. But it's a big thing to change. In part, again, because those biases exist in our society around how girls should participate in sport versus boys. That gets replicated within our houses and our family units, but it's certainly present in the sport system itself, which has really been built on a male model of sport and a male model of participation in sport. There has been progress on this, certainly, over the generations. But again, our participation rates are far too low. For instance, 1 out of 3 girls drops out of sport during adolescence compared to 1 out of 10 boys. So we see there's huge swaths of girls that are not getting those lifelong benefits. There can be a tendency to blame the girls themselves, to say they're not interested, they're more interested in other activities. You know, we're just responding to the fact that sport isn't something that girls like as much as boys. But there's tons and tons of research that tells us that that is kind of a convenient answer, because it doesn't acknowledge the role that the sports system itself plays in shaping the interests and the opportunities for girls to participate in the way that the boys do. So we really put the onus on the system to say it's important that girls are participating for the girls themselves, but also for the sports. Gender equity makes better sport. And so let's put the girls at the center. Let's design specifically for the girls to meet their needs and their interests, and create safe, welcoming, and inclusive environments that, frankly, you know, are fun and that give the girls what they're looking for, so that they do choose sport, because sport has been created for them. And so that involves the training that coaches get. It involves who is doing the coaching, more women specifically. It involves who's at those decision-making tables deciding what programs to run and when to run them, and how resources get allocated between the men's side and the women's side. It involves, frankly, being really creative and going outside of the box of what we consider sport to look like and to feel like and to sound like. So there's a whole myriad of different actions that can be taken by everybody who has a role to play. And what's really important, though, is that the research is there, the best practice is there, we need to start acting on it. And that requires a commitment from the sports themselves to increasing the number of girls participating and staying. That 4% stat is so troubling. And in fact, it extends well beyond social media. There was a study done of major media, broadcast and others that showed only 4%. And that's in an Olympic and Paralympic year when we do see a lot more women's sports stories being shared. And so I think it's really important to recognize what that means. For every 4 hours or 4 opportunities that girls have a chance to see women participating in sport, boys have 96. So it's it's a key part to us transforming the culture of sport and making women and girls feel as they belong in sport, and having men and boys understand that women belong in sport as well. So how do we change that? There's been a lot of talk about this, but I would say, again, it starts with a commitment to it and value for portraying and representing women's sports. It involves who the storytellers are. Who are the people behind the scenes deciding what's newsworthy, what's interesting, who are shaping and framing the stories. And there has been such a long tradition of celebrating men's sport. A lot of the people involved in media production around sport are also men. And so it's kind of a self-reinforcing culture in that sense. We need to have more women telling the stories themselves. And, but of course, men have a role to play as well behind the scenes in understanding the role that they can play in telling more effective stories. And I think that there was a really interesting example in this recent week, of Stephen Smith at ESPN did a short segment calling out an athlete who had there was some talk about how the women's sport movement should move forward. And he said something contrarian, and Stephen Smith really called him out and talked about the landscape of women's sports and the barriers facing women in sport, and gave credit to a number of his colleagues who are women who helped to open his eyes to that situation. So having women at the table, shaping the stories, making the decisions will go a long way to having more women's sports coverage. But it's a complex space, and there are a number of different actions ultimately that can play into that. This is a really frequently cited way for girls to become more inspired and engaged in sport, is to provide them with role models. And we absolutely agree, it's really important. What's interesting is that as part of our Rally Report study, which we released last spring with Canadian Tire Jumpstart Charities, we dug into that role model question a bit, and it's so interesting to see who girls reported as influencing their involvement in sport. Parents, older siblings, coaches, and teachers were among the highest. Celebrities, not actually that high, which doesn't mean that they don't have a role to play. I just think what I'm saying is that we need to expand our view of who a role model is and who a key influencer is on girls in sport. But absolutely, does girls seeing older girls, older women, maybe even same age girls playing, thriving, achieving, and being celebrated in sport, is that influential on their sense of belonging and sense of potential within sport? 100%. I think the question around how do we get more women involved in being role models is a little bit tricky, because the fact of the matter is that in a lot of sports, the women are there. They're there, but they're not visible and they're not promoted. And so it's not necessarily the fact that women aren't showing up and aren't willing to be those role models. It's that the opportunities for the girls to access them, to see them, to watch them play or watch them lead just aren't as present. There are some things that are shifting on that. And frankly, I think COVID has been wonderful in the sense that there's a lot more people turning to virtual platforms to do that storytelling and to access that storytelling and to access role models. And so I hope that that's something that will continue going forward. But absolutely, the women are there. We need the sports to celebrate them and to make them visible and to put them up. And then girls will have the opportunity to be inspired by them. So I would say with accountability, I'm gonna change a little bit. With accountability, it's consequences. Accountability requires consequences. That if you don't hold up your end of the bargain, if you don't meet expectations, something will happen. Or if you do, something great will happen. And so I think there has to be something at stake. And so I summarized that with consequences. For inclusion, I would say action. And you've heard me say that a few times in my answers, but it can't be performative. It can't be sort of the pink washing or whatever equivalent for inclusion more broadly. It has to be real, meaningful commitment to change, to doing things differently. And that may feel radical for some people because we can't create a whole new system through incremental change that doesn't actually disrupt the status quo. We have to disrupt the status quo in order to create a new system that everyone can participate in equitably. So real meaningful action, not one word. I kind of went my own way with that one. I hope that's okay.
No problem. We kind of just did this, but can you please talk about the 3 points that pertain to diversity and inclusion in sport, which is accountability, diversity, and inclusion?
Yeah, I would say that sport is not unique. I don't know a sector that isn't grappling with diversity and inclusion and accountability in that sense. I'll say this, as an organization, we really focus on equity as an important principle in our work, and frankly, as a strategy for how things move forward. And what equity really recognizes is that there are groups that have been historically disadvantaged, in this case within sport, and equity then seeks to rectify that. Which means recognizing that those historical disadvantages, recognizing the privileges that other groups have received, and taking that concrete action to close that gap. And it's not close that gap over the next 100 years. It's close that gap and quickly, which can sometimes mean giving people what they, sorry, I should say not sometimes, which means giving people what they need to succeed. And so what these historically disadvantaged groups need to succeed will probably look different than what the privileged groups will need. And it's that catch up, it's that corrective action. And again, for some, that can feel really, really radical. But it's a really important principle to embrace because it tells us that what women are looking for is not necessarily exactly the same as what men are looking for. Women may need different things in order to get to the level or get to the level of opportunities that men currently enjoy. And so when we're talking about accountability, diversity, inclusion, and how we move that forward, I think equity really needs to be at the forefront of that conversation. System responsibility, there's so much blaming of the individuals or the groups for their own situation. Well, what we know is that we have systems that have created this and that are reinforcing these circumstances. It is not the fault of women, or it is not the fault of BIPOC individuals or people with disabilities that they aren't at the same level as white, cisgender men. it's the systems that have been created to privilege some groups over other groups. And it's the system's responsibility, therefore, to change that. But we know systems are people, culture is people. And so as individual leaders, we need to take on the responsibility with the influence and the privilege that we have to change those systems, change those policies and practices. And such an excellent way to move this forward is to make sure that these underrepresented groups are at the table, part of making the decisions, and not one of them. We need lots of diversity and lots of inclusion, that ability to participate fully and authentically and in a way that's respected and valued. Then you're going to get more inclusive decisions coming out of tables that look like that. Not inclusive tables, not inclusive decisions. So there are so many different pathways towards creating change on this front, but there are some really important underlying principles and approaches that have to be present if this is going to move forward. The simple answer is that there's no silver bullet to an inclusive sport system, inclusive sport industry. That would be really handy and really convenient for sure. It's going to take time and persistence. It's going to take people taking responsibility for this and being held accountable for it. And it's going to take more than a belief that this is the right thing to do, or that doing this is like doing something good for women or good for other underrepresented groups. It has to be linked to strategy, because strategy is what directs investment and resource allocations and all sorts of things. It's the thing ultimately within a given organization that we're accountable to. Top companies understand that inclusion is a competitive advantage. It leads to better performance across the board. And also combined with that, top companies increasingly recognize that leading with purpose is essential to winning in the world right now. And so there's so much benefit, yes, to women and other groups of being included, but gender equity and other forms of equity builds better sport, builds better companies, builds better society. And the leaders who understand that and who do the work and who harness the potential of this are absolutely the ones that are going to succeed as we move through this century and beyond.